The wind howled against the cottage walls, as if the storm itself had taken offense to the stranger's presence. Alara's fingers tightened around the doorframe, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. Behind her, she could hear Fenris rising from his place by the fire, a low growl building in his chest like distant thunder. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though her voice betrayed her with its tremor. The man before her stood impossibly still in the driving snow, not a single flake settling on his dark coat. His beauty was sharp-edged, dangerous, the kind that belonged in museums or nightmares, not on her doorstep. "Don't you?" Lucian tilted his head, and something predatory flickered behind his starlight eyes. 3 years ago, during a blizzard much like this one, something precious was taken from me. Something that belongs at my side, not playing house with a lonely veterinarian on the moors. The word lonely hit her like a physical blow. It was true, pathetically true, but hearing it spoken aloud by this beautiful stranger made her chest tighten with shame. She started to close the door, but his hand shot out faster than thought, fingers wrapping around the edge with impossible strength. "I'm not finished." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried over the storm. "May I come in, Alara? We have so much to discuss." She hadn't told him her name. The realization sent ice through her veins, colder than the highland wind. "How do you—" Fenris appeared at her side, massive head level with her shoulder. At full height, he stood nearly 4 feet tall, silver fur rippling with muscle that belonged on no natural wolf. His blue eyes, those impossible, too human eyes, fixed on the stranger with recognition that made Alara's stomach drop. "Ah," Lucian breathed, and for the first time genuine emotion cracked his perfect composure. "There you are, my prince. Do you know how long I've searched?" Prince. The word echoed in Alara's mind, stirring something deep and uncomfortable. She'd called Fenris that sometimes, hadn't she? A joke between them, because of the regal way he carried himself, the intelligence that gleamed in his gaze. But this man spoke it like a title, like truth. Fenris stepped forward, placing his bulk between Alara and the stranger. When he spoke, it wasn't with the dream voice she'd grown accustomed to, soft whispers in her sleep that felt like shared secrets. This was different. This was real. She doesn't remember. The words formed in her mind with crystal clarity, but they weren't her thoughts. They carried Fenris's essence, his protective fury, and something deeper, something that felt like goodbye. "Leave her in peace, Lucian. She suffered enough for our sins." Alara stumbled backward, her medical training screaming that what she'd just experienced was impossible. Animals didn't speak telepathically. They didn't grow to impossible sizes or heal from mortal wounds in a matter of hours. They didn't— Stop. The word tore from her throat as memories she didn't understand began to surface. Flashes of candlelight and ancient stone, of her hands weaving light like thread, of this same beautiful face twisted with anguish as she spoke words that tasted of power and heartbreak. "Stop. I can't. This isn't real." "Isn't it?" Lucian's voice was gentle now, heartbreakingly tender. "Look at your hands, beloved. Look at them and tell me you don't remember what they can do." Against her will, Alara looked down. Her hands were glowing. Soft, silver light emanated from her palms, the same light she'd seen when she'd healed Fenris that first night. The same light she'd convinced herself was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. The cottage around her seemed to shift, shadows deepening and stretching until they looked less like a simple veterinarian's home and more like something ancient. Something that had stood on this moor for centuries, not decades. The herbs hanging from her kitchen beams weren't just for cooking. She could suddenly name their magical properties, remember gathering them under moonlight with purposes that had nothing to do with modern medicine. No. She pressed her glowing hands to her temples, but the memories kept coming. A ritual circle. Blood and silver and desperate love. A curse spoken through tears because it was the only way to save him, even if it damned them both. "No, I'm Dr. Alara Thornwick. I graduated from Edinburgh. I treat sheep and cattle and—" "And you've been alone for 7 years," Lucian said softly. Ever since the dream started, ever since you began to remember, in pieces, who you really are. Fenris pressed against her leg, solid and warm and real. Her anchor in a world that was suddenly shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. But even he felt different now. Not just her rescued wolf pup, but something far older and more complex. Something with its own terrible history. The storm raged around them, but inside the cottage, the air had gone still as death. Three beings stood locked in a moment that had been centuries in the making, while the first threads of a spell Elara didn't remember casting began to unravel around them. The silence stretched like a held breath until Elara broke it with a sharp laugh that bordered on hysteria. "This is insane." She stepped back from both of them, the impossible stranger and the wolf who apparently spoke in her mind. "You're both insane, and I'm having some kind of breakdown." The silver light flickering around her hand said otherwise, but she clenched her fists, willing it to disappear. She was Dr. Elara Thornwick. She had a degree from Edinburgh's veterinary school, framed and hanging in her small office. She had patient files, appointment books, a Land Rover with veterinary supplies. She had a life, small and solitary as it was. "I need you both to leave." The words came out steadier than she felt. "Whatever this is, whatever game you're playing, I won't be part of it." Lucian's expression softened with something that might have been pity. "Where will you go, beloved? Back to your rounds tomorrow morning? Mrs. MacLeod's arthritic collie? Young Jamie's prize ram?" The fact that he knew her clients sent fresh ice through her veins, but she lifted her chin. "Yes, exactly that. Because that's what I do. That's who I am." "And at night?" His voice was velvet over steel. "When the dreams come. When you see my face in the fire and taste magic on your tongue. When you wake up calling names you swear you've never heard." She wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. Because he was right about the dreams, about the loneliness that had driven her to this isolated corner of Scotland 7 years ago, seeking something she couldn't name, about the way she'd thrown herself into her work, treating every injured animal with a desperate intensity that her colleagues had called admirable, but she knew was really just another form of running. "I help things," she whispered. "I save them." "Yes." Fenris's voice in her mind was unbearably gentle. "You always did." The memories that statement triggered made her legs weak. She sank onto her worn sofa, the same one where she'd spent countless evenings reading veterinary journals by lamplight. Fenris stretched across her feet, where she'd dozed off watching old films, the wolves breathing a comfort against the endless quiet. This cottage had been her sanctuary for 7 years, 4 years alone, then 3 blessed ones with Fenris. It was small and draughty, the stone walls perpetually damp from highland mists, but it was hers. She thought of her morning routine, coffee from the ancient percolator, the weather forecast crackling over the radio, checking her appointment book while Fenris waited patiently for his breakfast. She thought of her truck loaded with supplies, the familiar weight of her medical bag, the way farmers' faces lit up when she managed to save a sick calf or ease an old dog's pain. "I matter here," she said aloud, as much to herself as to them. "People depend on me." 7 families, Lucian observed, within a 20-mile radius. You see perhaps 20 people in a month, and half of them barely speak to you beyond discussing their animals' ailments. The casual cruelty of his accuracy stung. It was true that her social life consisted mainly of professional interactions, true that she'd driven away the few who'd tried to get closer, the postal worker who'd lingered too long at her door, the young minister who'd invited her to community events with hopeful eyes. She'd told herself she preferred the solitude, that people were complicated in ways that animals weren't. But there were moments, watching elderly Mr. Sinclair's face when she'd saved his last remaining ewe, or seeing the relief in a child's eyes when she'd mended their pet rabbit's broken leg, when she felt something deeper than professional satisfaction, purpose, maybe, or love. In its way. "Mrs. MacLeod needs me," she said stubbornly. "Her Bonnie has been struggling since the cold snap started. And you'll treat her arthritis with medicines that work well enough," Fenris said gently. "But if you remembered what your hands could truly do—" "Stop." She pressed her palms against her knees, hiding the faint luminescence that still flickered there. I don't want to remember anything else. I want you both to leave so I can pretend this never happened. Lucian moved closer, and she caught his scent, winter wind and something darker, like old leather and older promises. What life are you so desperate to return to, Elara? Long days driving empty roads, evenings alone with only Fenris for company, nights when you stand at your window and wonder what you're missing, what piece of yourself you've lost. Her breath caught because, yes, she did that. She stood at her kitchen window in the dark hours before dawn, staring across the moor and feeling hollow in ways that had nothing to do with hunger or fatigue. She'd convinced herself it was normal, the restlessness of a woman approaching middle age, the natural melancholy of isolation. But now, with her hands glowing and impossible truths hanging in the air between them, that explanation felt as fragile as spider silk. You know nothing about my life, she whispered. But the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears, because standing here in her cottage, her sanctuary, with supernatural beings casually dissecting her existence, she could suddenly see it all with brutal clarity, the careful routines that filled her days but not the emptiness inside her. The way she talked to Fenris as if he were human, because she was so starved for real conversation. The nights she woke, gasping from dreams of another life, another self, and spent hours at that same window he'd mentioned, searching the darkness for something that remained maddeningly out of reach. The cottage suddenly felt smaller, its stone walls pressing closer. Outside, the storm that had brought Lucian to her door continued its assault, but she barely heard it over the rushing in her ears. This was what drowning felt like, she thought distantly. Not water filling her lungs, but the slow collapse of everything she'd built to keep the truth at bay. Fenris padded closer, his massive frame radiating the same protective warmth that had sustained her through 3 years of isolation. But now she could feel something else emanating from him, a tension that made the air itself seem to hum. When he spoke in her mind again, his voice carried centuries of weariness. "Show her," he said to Lucian, though his blue eyes never left Elara's face. "She needs to see what she's choosing between." Fenris, no. The vampire's composure finally cracked, revealing something raw beneath the elegant mask. "If I show her everything now, she'll remember it all." Fenris's mental voice was firm, as she should have years ago, if I hadn't been selfish enough to let her forget. Elara looked between them, her medical training grappling with the impossibility of this conversation. "What are you talking about? Show me what?" Lucian's hands clenched at his sides, and she saw his perfect features twist with what looked like actual pain. "The night you cast the binding, the night you chose to save my life by trapping Fenris, trapping Cassius, in wolf form and scattering your own memories across lifetimes." The names hit her like physical blows. Cassius. She knew that name, had whispered it in dreams she couldn't quite recall upon waking, and the binding, images flickered at the edges of her consciousness, candlelight and desperate magic, and the taste of her own tears. "I don't," she began, but Lucian raised his hand, and the air around them began to shimmer. "You were dying," he said softly, and suddenly she could see it. Not in her mind, but here in the cottage itself, as if the past were bleeding through the present like watercolors in rain. Hunters had found our sanctuary. They'd used blessed silver, weapons designed to kill our kind slowly. The familiar walls of her cottage wavered, and beneath them she glimpsed older stone, carved with symbols that her rational mind insisted were impossible, but her soul recognized with aching familiarity. Candles flickered where her electric lamps stood. The scent of burning herbs replaced the everyday smells of tea and wood smoke. "You weren't Dr. Thornwick then," Lucian continued, his voice threading through the vision like a narrator describing her own forgotten life. "You were Elara Ravencrest, hedge witch of the Thornwick Moor, my beloved, my equal, my salvation and my damnation both." She watched herself, a woman who looked exactly like her, but moved with confidence she'd never possessed, whose eyes held power instead of the careful emptiness she'd cultivated, weaving magic with hands that blazed silver bright. This other Alara was speaking words in a language that predated English, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. "The spell you cast that night saved us both," Lucian whispered. "But it broke you into pieces, scattered your memories, your power, your very identity across centuries of mortal lives. You've been reborn again and again, always drawn back to this place, always searching for what you'd lost without knowing what it was." The vision intensified, and she could feel the magic flowing through her other self's veins like molten starlight. Could see Cassius, beautiful, golden-haired Cassius, who looked nothing like her gentle Fenris, but whose eyes held the same ancient sadness, accepting his wolf form as the price of Lucian's survival. Why? The word tore from her throat as the present reasserted itself, leaving her gasping in her ordinary cottage with its ordinary electric lights and very extraordinary occupants. Why would I do that to myself? To him? Fenris pressed his muzzle against her trembling hands, and his mental voice was infinitely gentle. "Because you loved us both, and because there was no other way." The choice crystallized before her with terrifying clarity. She could cling to her small, safe life as Dr. Thornwick, continue her rounds, treat her patients, grow old alone but peacefully on the moor. Or she could step into the truth that blazed just beyond her reach, knowing it would destroy the woman she'd convinced herself she was. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, gravity pulling at her while every instinct screamed to step back from the precipice. Alara sat frozen on her sofa, hands pressed flat against her knees to hide their trembling, while the weight of impossible choices settled around her like stones. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely audible above the dying wind outside. "I can't be what you're asking me to be." The cottage felt different now, simultaneously too small and vast as an ocean. Every familiar object seemed to mock her, the veterinary journals stacked neatly on her bookshelf, the appointment calendar hanging by the door, the framed degree that proclaimed her Dr. Ilara Thornwick in neat black letters. 7 years of careful construction, and these two beings had unraveled it all in a single evening. "What you're describing, this Ilara Ravencrest, she's not me." She looked up at Lucian, desperate for him to understand. "I don't know magic. I can barely keep my percolator working. I'm just a veterinarian who talks to her wolf too much and hasn't had a real conversation with another human being in months." Lucian's expression was unreadable, but she caught something that might have been disappointment flickering in those starlight eyes. "And yet your hands still glow when you're distressed. You still dream in languages you've never learned. You still—" "Stop." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Just stop trying to convince me I'm someone I'm not." But even as she spoke, part of her mind was cataloguing the impossibilities she'd been ignoring for years. The way injured animals seemed to heal faster under her care than medical science could explain. The herbs she gathered on the moor, telling herself they were for cooking while her hands moved with practiced certainty toward plants she'd never studied. The dreams that felt more like memories, filled with faces and voices that made her wake with tears on her cheeks and names on her lips that turned to mist the moment she tried to grasp them. Fenris shifted beside her, his massive weight settling against her leg like an anchor. When he spoke in her mind, his voice carried a sadness that made her chest ache. "I would stay," he said quietly. "If you choose to remain as you are, I would stay with you until the end of your mortal days. We could continue as we have, you and I against the loneliness." The offer should have been a comfort, but instead it felt like a death sentence. Because now she knew what he was sacrificing, not just a wolf choosing his human companion, but a vampire lord, Cassius, trapped in fur and fang by her own desperate magic, accepting eternal imprisonment rather than force her to remember what she'd chosen to forget. "How long?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "How long have you both been waiting for me to remember? This incarnation?" 7 years, Lucian replied, "since the dreams first began to surface and drew you back to this place. But before that—" He paused, and something like grief shadowed his perfect features. "I have been searching for you for 3 centuries, beloved. through 17 different lives. 17 lives. 17 versions of herself, born and lived and died, while these two immortal beings waited for her to become whole again. The scope of it staggered her, made her feel simultaneously insignificant and impossibly precious. The others, the other me's, did any of them remember? Fragments, Fenris answered gently. Never enough. You always died young, as if some part of your soul knew it hadn't found what it was seeking. The weight of all those lost years pressed down on her. All those incomplete lives lived in the shadow of a truth she couldn't grasp. How many times had she stood at windows like this one, searching empty horizons for something she couldn't name? How many times had she chosen isolation over connection, driven by instincts she didn't understand? I have patients who need me, she said suddenly, grasping for the mundane reality that had sustained her. Mrs. MacLeod's collie, Jamie's ram. Tomorrow is Thursday. I have 4 appointments scheduled. Yes, Lucian said softly. You do. She looked at him sharply, surprised by his lack of argument. So you understand why I can't just abandon my responsibilities? I understand that you're terrified, he replied with devastating gentleness. I understand that the life you've built, small as it may be, feels safer than stepping into a power that once moved mountains and commanded storms. I understand that you would rather remain half alive than risk becoming fully yourself. His words hit like physical blows because they were true. She was terrified of the magic that flickered beneath her skin, of the memories that threatened to drown her in their intensity, of the love she could feel pressing against the barriers in her mind like floodwater behind a cracking dam. Most of all, she was terrified of losing the careful emptiness she'd cultivated. It wasn't happiness, but it wasn't the devastating heartbreak she sensed waiting in her forgotten past either. Outside, the storm had quieted to gentle snow, but inside the cottage, the real tempest was just beginning. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the soft whisper of snow against glass. Elara stared at her hands, these treacherous hands that glowed with impossible light, and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. What happens to Dr. Thornwick? She whispered. What happens to the woman I've been for 7 years? Lucian's expression gentled, and for the first time since he'd appeared at her door, she saw not the commanding vampire king, but something achingly vulnerable beneath his otherworldly beauty. She becomes part of something larger. She doesn't disappear, beloved. She finally comes home. The word home hit her like a physical blow because she realized with sudden, devastating clarity that she had never felt at home. Not in 7 years of this cottage, not in the decade of veterinary practice before that, not in all the careful routines and professional accomplishments that should have added up to a life. She had been a woman treading water in an ocean of her own making, mistaking motion for progress. Mrs. MacLeod's collie, she said again, but the words felt hollow now, a lifeline that was already fraying in her grip. Will be treated by the locum who covers your practice during emergencies, Lucian replied gently. Dr. Morrison from Inverness. You've called him before. Of course he knew about Morrison. Of course he had thought this through while she was still clinging to the illusion that she had a choice. But the casual competence of his planning felt less like manipulation and more like care, as if he had been preparing for this moment while desperately hoping it would never come. Fenris's warm bulk pressed closer, and his mental voice wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. You don't have to choose between helping and being who you are, Elara. The magic that flows through your blood, it's the same power that's driven you to heal. You've always been drawn to wounded things because your soul remembers what it's like to be broken. The truth of that statement resonated through her bones. Every injured animal she'd saved, every desperate midnight call she'd answered, it hadn't just been duty or professional dedication. It had been something deeper, more primal, a need to mend that felt as essential as breathing. She thought of the sparrow with the broken wing she'd found on her doorstep 3 months ago. No reasonable veterinarian would have spent hours setting bones so delicate they were barely visible, but she had worked through the night with a focus that bordered on obsession. When it had flown away a week later, She had watched from her kitchen window and felt a completeness she couldn't explain. "I remember," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Not everything, but fragments, working by candlelight, hands covered in blood and silver light, the taste of magic like copper pennies on my tongue." She looked up at Lucian, her breath coming faster. "You were dying, really dying. I could feel your life slipping away like water through my fingers." His perfect composure finally cracked entirely, revealing raw hunger and hope and what might have been love. "Yes, and Cassius." She turned to Fenris, seeing past the wolf's form to the golden-haired vampire lord she'd condemned to centuries of fur and silence. "You tried to stop me. You said there had to be another way." "There was no other way," Fenris replied, his mental voice thick with old grief. "I knew it even as I begged you to reconsider. You were dying too, the magic burning through you faster than your mortal body could channel it. The binding was the only spell powerful enough to save Lucian, and it required—" He paused, as if the words still hurt after all these centuries. "It required everything you were." The memory surfaced fully then, washing over her like a tide she was too tired to fight. The stone circle on the moor, older than the Roman roads and twice as sacred. Her own voice chanting words that seemed to tear themselves from her throat. Cassius's human form dissolving into lupine grace, while Lucian's wounds sealed themselves with silver fire. And through it all, the terrible awareness that she was unmaking herself, scattering her essence across time like seeds on barren ground. "I loved you both," she whispered, and knew it was true. Had always been true, through 17 lifetimes of forgetting. "You still do," Lucian said simply. "That's why you're so afraid." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she had spent so many restless hours searching empty horizons. The moor stretched before her, blanketed in fresh snow that gleamed silver under the clearing sky. Somewhere out there was the stone circle where she had willingly destroyed herself for love. Somewhere out there was the life she had fled from and the power she had scattered to the winds. Behind her, she heard Lucian move closer, felt the supernatural chill that clung to his immortal flesh. "The choice is yours, beloved. It always has been. But choose knowing that this time there may not be another chance. The binding grows weaker with each passing year. If you reject the memories now, they may fade forever." She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the window. Such a simple thing, breathing, such a human thing. If she stepped into her true nature, would she lose even that small mortality? "Will I still be me?" The question was barely a whisper. "You'll be more yourself than you've ever been," Fenris answered with absolute certainty. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and starlight. Inside the cottage, Alara Thornwick took her last breath, as a woman who believed herself ordinary. "And God help us all," she said, turning away from the window and toward the impossible future waiting in immortal eyes. "Show me how to remember." The words had barely left her lips when the cottage began to change around them, not the gentle shimmer of Lucian's earlier vision, but a violent restructuring of reality that made her teeth ache. The electric lights flickered and died, replaced by the warm glow of dozens of candles that materialized from nothing. Her worn furniture dissolved like morning mist, revealing older pieces carved from dark wood and inlaid with silver symbols that pulsed with their own inner light. "The remembering isn't gentle," Lucian warned, his voice seeming to come from very far away despite his proximity. 3 centuries of scattered memories returning all at once. The first wave hit her like a physical blow, dropping her to her knees on stone floors that had been carpet moments before. Images flooded her consciousness, herself at 17, discovering she could coax roses to bloom in winter, at 23, healing a plague-stricken village with nothing but herbs and will, at 30, standing in this very circle of stones, and calling down lightning to defend her people from raiders who burned accused witches for sport. "Too much," she gasped, pressing her palms against her temples as 17 lifetimes of experiences crashed together in her skull. "I can't." Fenris was beside her instantly, his massive form providing an anchor as her sense of self threatened to shatter completely. Through their connection, she felt him shouldering some of the burden, his ancient strength helping her process the overwhelming flood. "Breathe," he commanded, his mental voice cutting through the chaos. "You are still you. You are all of them, but you are still fundamentally Alara." But even as she struggled to stay conscious under the assault of returning memories, she became aware of something else, a presence in the cottage that hadn't been there before. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and both Lucian and Fenris went rigid with sudden alertness. "We have a problem," Lucian said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her forget her own crisis. When she looked up through tear-blurred vision, she saw him standing protectively between her and the door, his elegant facade replaced by something predatory and dangerous. The door didn't burst open. It simply ceased to exist, dissolving into shadow and letting in a wind that smelled of grave earth and old blood. 3 figures stepped through the gap, and even in her compromised state, Alara recognized them for what they were, vampires, but not like Lucian. These moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of the newly turned, their eyes holding no ancient wisdom, only hunger. "Vampire King," the leader spoke, his voice like grinding stone. He was young, couldn't have been more than 20 when he was turned, but something in his bearing suggested he commanded the others. "We felt the awakening. The old magic calls to us. Matthias." Lucian's response was arctic. "You were warned to stay away from this place." The young vampire smiled, revealing fangs that were too long, too sharp, a sign of poor control that made Alara's veterinary instincts catalogue him as dangerous in the way of a rabid animal. Warnings from a king who abandoned his throne for a mortal witch. "Your authority died the night you chose exile, old one." The cottage shuddered around them, and Alara realized with dawning horror that her returning memories were affecting the physical space. Raw power was bleeding from her overwhelmed consciousness, making the very air unstable. The careful balance that had hidden this place for 3 centuries was unraveling. "She cannot control it yet," Matthias continued, his hungry gaze fixed on her. "The power of Alara Ravencrest, loose and untrained. Do you know what we could accomplish with such magic bound to our will? You will not touch her." The words came from Fenris, but they carried the authority of his human voice, Prince Cassius reasserting himself through lupine form. The sound made all 3 young vampires step back involuntarily. "The Wolf Prince speaks," one of them hissed. "How delicious. Both of the king's lovers in one place, and neither strong enough to protect their precious witch." That was when Alara felt it. The part of herself that was not Dr. Thornwick, not the careful woman who treated injured animals and lived quietly on the moor. Something vast and terrible stirred in her chest, responding to the threat against her beloved ones with the kind of rage that had once turned armies of hunters to ash. The candles around the cottage flared so bright they became miniature suns. The temperature spiked, then plummeted, then spiked again as her chaotic emotions pulled at forces she couldn't yet control. Most importantly, she felt the cottage's ancient protections responding to her presence, wards that had been dormant for 3 centuries suddenly blazing to life. "Impossible," Matthias breathed, taking another step back as silver light began to pour from Alara's skin. The binding should have destroyed her power permanently. "You understand nothing," Lucian said, and now his voice carried the full weight of centuries of command. The binding didn't destroy her power, it distilled it, concentrated it through 17 lifetimes of forgetting and remembering. "You're not facing the hedge witch who cast the original spell, boy. You're facing 300 years of accumulated magical potential finally finding its way home." The young vampires exchanged uncertain glances, but it was too late for retreat. Alara was rising to her feet, silver fire coursing through her veins, and for the first time in any of her lives, she was truly completely awake. The silver fire coursing through Alara's veins felt like coming home and dying all at once. She stood in the center of the transformed cottage, power crackling between her fingers, But beneath the surge of awakened magic lay a terror so profound it threatened to tear her apart from within. This wasn't just remembering. This was becoming something that could unmake worlds with a careless thought. Elara. Lucian's voice cut through the chaos in her mind, steady and grounding. Look at me. She turned toward him, and through the haze of silver light pouring from her skin, she saw not the Vampire King, but simply the man she had loved enough to destroy herself for. His dark eyes held no fear of her power, only an infinite patience that spoke of centuries spent waiting for this moment. I don't know how to control it, she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the cottage walls shiver. The young vampires had retreated to the far side of the room, but she could feel their hunger pressing against her consciousness like wolves circling wounded prey. I can feel everything. Every spell I ever cast, every life I ever lived. It's too much. Then don't try to control it, Fenris said, his mental voice calm despite the supernatural tension filling the air. Not yet. Just aim it. Matthias chose that moment to test their defenses, lunging forward with inhuman speed toward Ilara's exposed flank. He made it 3 steps before her power lashed out instinctively, sending him sprawling against the far wall with enough force to crack the ancient stone. Interesting, he wheezed, pulling himself upright with a grin that was all predator. The witch has teeth, but untrained power is like wildfire, burns as much as it protects. He was right, and they all knew it. Already she could feel the magic eating at her mortal frame, demanding more than her human body could safely channel. In her fragmented memories, she saw herself at 30, the night she cast the binding, and understood with devastating clarity why that version of herself had been willing to scatter her soul across centuries. The alternative had been burning out completely, taking Lucian and Cassius with her. We need to get her out of here, Lucian said quietly, his supernatural hearing no doubt catching the strain in her too rapid heartbeat. The awakening is drawing attention from more than just these fledglings. As if summoned by his words, the night outside began to sing, a sound like wind through a graveyard that spoke of older, hungrier things stirring on the moor. Elara felt them moving in the darkness beyond the cottage's protective wards. Vampires, yes, but also other creatures drawn by the scent of unleashed power. Things that had slept in the stone circles and bog hollows, waiting for magic strong enough to sustain their ancient hungers. A stone circle, she gasped, sudden understanding flooding through her. I need to complete the binding. Not to trap you, to anchor the power properly. Lucian's expression went carefully blank. Beloved, the circle is what created this entire situation. If you attempt another binding without full control, then I'll die, she finished, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. But if I don't, this power will tear through every barrier between the mortal world and things that should stay buried. I can feel them waking up, Lucian. All of them. Every creature that once answered to Elara Ravencrest is remembering what they owed her. The cottage shuddered again, and through the dissolved doorway she could see shapes moving in the snow. Pale figures that walked with too fluid grace, their eyes reflecting the silver light bleeding from her skin. The entire supernatural community of northern Scotland is converging on this location, Fenris observed with the tactical awareness of his princely nature. We have perhaps 20 minutes before this becomes a war zone. Matthias laughed, the sound sharp with genuine delight. Let them come. When the witch burns herself out trying to contain power beyond mortal comprehension, we'll feast on what remains. Vampire kings, wolf princes, ancient magic, all of it will flow through us. The casual cruelty in his voice triggered something primal in Elara's awakening memories. She remembered now why she had been so feared in her original life, not just for her healing magic, but for the terrible justice she had dispensed to those who threatened what she loved. You want to see untrained power? She asked softly, and her voice carried echoes of 17 different lifetimes. The silver light around her began to shift, taking on edges that cut at reality itself. Let me show you what 300 years of accumulated rage looks like. Elara, no. Lucian started forward, but she was already moving, not toward Matthias, but toward the window that faced the stone circle. "If I'm going to burn out anyway," she said, looking back at the two immortal beings who had shaped every incarnation of her existence, "then let it be in service of something larger than revenge." Outside, the ancient powers of the Moor continued their inexorable approach, drawn by magic that sang of possibilities and destruction in equal measure. The choice was no longer between her quiet life and embracing her nature. It was between controlled destruction and chaos that would consume everything she had ever fought to protect. The window exploded outward in a shower of silver-edged glass, as Alara's power erupted beyond all mortal containment. She didn't step through the opening. She flowed, her form becoming something between flesh and pure magic as she moved toward the ancient stone circle that had defined her fate across centuries. Behind her, she heard Lucian's sharp curse and the sound of violence as he and Fenris engaged Matthias and his followers. But those sounds felt distant now, muffled by the roaring in her ears as 17 lifetimes of magical knowledge crashed together in her consciousness like storm waves against cliffs. The snow beneath her feet didn't melt. It transformed, each flake becoming a tiny prism that caught and refracted the light pouring from her skin. The Moor itself seemed to recognize her, the ancient ley lines that crisscrossed the landscape humming to life after centuries of dormancy. She could feel the power flowing up through the earth, eager to answer her call, and for the first time understood why she had always felt so drawn to this desolate place. This was where she belonged. This was where she had always belonged. The stone circle rose before her like the ribs of some prehistoric beast, each megalith carved with symbols that blazed silver in response to her presence. As she crossed the threshold into the sacred space, the temperature dropped so precipitously that her breath came out in clouds of glittering frost. But she felt no cold. The fire in her veins burned too hot for such mortal concerns. "Alara Ravencrest," she whispered to herself, testing the name that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Alara Thornwick. Alara, but the other names were lost in the chaos of returning memories, 17 different identities blurring together until she could no longer tell where one life ended and another began. That was when she felt them coming. Not the vampires and other supernatural predators drawn by her awakening, but something far worse. The very foundations of reality were beginning to crack under the pressure of her uncontrolled power, and through those cracks, things that had been banished eons ago were pressing close to the mortal world. She saw them in her mind's eye, entities of pure hunger and malevolence that existed between the spaces of creation, sustained by chaos and contradiction. They had been locked away since before humans learned to speak, but her fractured magical field was creating the exact conditions they needed to break free. She gasped, falling to her knees in the center of the circle as the full scope of what she'd unleashed became clear. Not this. Never this. The stone beneath her palms was warm despite the freezing air, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Through her connection to the circle, she could feel the protective wards she'd woven 3 centuries ago, complex, beautiful magic that had kept the Moor's supernatural population in careful balance. But those wards were designed for her original power level, not the accumulated magical potential of 17 lifetimes. They were failing. One by one, she felt the barriers collapse as entities pressed against them from dimensions that should have remained forever sealed. Each failure sent shockwaves through the magical ecosystem of northern Scotland, and she knew that what was happening here wouldn't remain contained. The chaos would spread, unmaking the careful balance between the supernatural and mundane worlds that countless witches and sorcerers had died to maintain. Through the rising magical storm, she heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Lucian appeared at the circle's edge, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his clothes torn from battle. Behind him came Fenris, the great wolf's silver fur matted with what looked suspiciously like vampire ash. "The fledglings are dealt with," Lucian reported, his voice carefully controlled. "But we have bigger problems. I can feel at least 20 more supernatural entities converging on this location, and that's just the ones I recognize. It's not them I'm worried about. Elara said, her voice strange to her own ears. Lucian, I've broken something that can't be fixed. The barriers between worlds, they're coming apart. He stepped into the circle without hesitation, his immortal nature allowing him to withstand the chaotic, magical currents that would have killed a mortal human instantly. When his hands touched her shoulders, she felt some of the wild energy flow into him, seeking an outlet through his ancient strength. Then we fix them, he said simply. Together. The way we should have 3 centuries ago. The binding nearly destroyed me the first time, and that was just to save your life and curse Cassius. This, she gestured helplessly at the cracks in reality spreading outward from the circle like fractures in glass. This would require everything I am, everything I've ever been. There wouldn't be enough left to... To what? Fenris padded into the circle, his wolf form shimmering as Cassius fought to resume human shape. To live another quiet life, pretending you're something you're not? The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had spent 17 lifetimes running from this moment, choosing mortality and forgetting over the terrible responsibility of her true nature. But the magic wouldn't be denied forever, and now her fear had created a crisis that threatened everything she had ever sought to protect. Around them, the ancient stones began to sing, a harmonic resonance that spoke of choices and consequences, of power that demanded its price in blood and sacrifice and love. The harmonic resonance of the stones grew louder, becoming a discordant shriek that made reality itself seem to buckle and warp. Elara pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound was coming from inside her skull now, the collective scream of 17 different souls trying to inhabit one mortal frame. "I can't hold them together," she gasped, feeling her carefully constructed sense of self beginning to fracture. The veterinarian who had lived quietly for 34 years was dissolving, subsumed by memories of the witch who had commanded armies of the dead, the healer who had ended plagues with a whispered word, the woman who had loved so fiercely she'd torn holes in time itself. Through the growing chaos, she felt Lucian's hands tighten on her shoulders. "Stay with me, beloved. Stay present." But present was becoming an increasingly meaningless concept. The boundaries between past and future were blurring as badly as those between dimensions, and she could see all her lives spreading out like cards from a deck, each one ending in the same moment of choice, the same terrible sacrifice made for love. "Elara." Fenris's voice carried the desperate authority of Prince Cassius. "Look at what's happening." She forced her fragmenting consciousness to focus on the world beyond her internal storm, and immediately wished she hadn't. The cracks in reality had widened into gaping wounds, and through them she could see the spaces between worlds, vast expanses of hungry void where things that should not exist writhed and pressed against the failing barriers. But worse than the cosmic horrors were the immediate consequences. The supernatural convergence Lucian had warned about was accelerating, drawn not just by her power but by the weakening of every protective ward in northern Scotland. Vampires, fae, werewolves, spirits of the moor, all the creatures that had lived in careful hiding were being forced into the open as their sanctuaries collapsed. "The binding won't work," she said with sudden, terrible clarity. "Not the way I did it before. I used my own life force as the anchor, but there isn't enough left in this incarnation to contain what I've become." Lucian's face went ashen in the silver light. "There has to be another way." "There is," Fenris said quietly, his wolf form beginning to shift and blur as Cassius fought to break free of the curse. "Use us. We're immortal. We can bear the weight of a binding that would destroy a mortal." "No." The word tore from Elara's throat with enough force to make the nearest stone crack. "I won't sacrifice you again. I won't watch you disappear into some half-existence for another 3 centuries. Then we all die here," Cassius said, his human voice finally breaking through as his transformation completed. He stood before her in his true form, tall and lean with silver hair that matched his wolf coat, his eyes holding centuries of patient love. Along with everyone we might have protected. The truth of it was spreading around them like ripples in a pond. Already she could hear screaming in the distance as reality storms ravaged the outlying settlements. Sheep were being born with too many eyes. Children were seeing through walls. The aurora borealis was shining at ground level, turning the snow into fields of burning light. "There's another option," Lucian said slowly, his vampire senses no doubt picking up something she couldn't perceive. "If the binding requires more life force than one mortal can provide." Alara felt her heart stop as she understood what he was suggesting. "You want me to drain you, both of you?" "Not drain. Share. Pool our immortal essence with your accumulated power. Create a binding so absolute it doesn't just repair the barriers but reinforces them permanently. The cost would be our existence as we know it," Cassius finished. "We understand. But Alara, look around you. This isn't just about us anymore." She followed his gaze and saw the truth written in silver fire across the night sky. The dimensional fractures were multiplying exponentially, and through them came whispers of things that made even ancient vampires seem benign by comparison. The choice was no longer between sacrifice and salvation, it was between controlled annihilation and chaos that would consume worlds. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't lose you, not again." Lucian's hand cupped her face with infinite gentleness. "You won't lose us. We'll be part of the magic, part of the protection itself. Eternal guardians instead of eternal wanderers. But I'll be alone." "No," Cassius said, kneeling beside her as the stones screamed their harmony of endings and beginnings. "You'll carry us with you, forever. In every spell, every healing, every moment of wonder. That's not death, beloved. That's transformation." The dimensional cracks widened further, and something vast and tentacled pressed against the failing barriers with hunger that made the air taste of copper and despair. Around them, the snow began to fall upward, and Alara realized with dawning horror that they were out of time. The choice hung before her like a blade: save the world by destroying everything she loved, or watch everything she'd ever fought to protect burn in the fires of uncontrolled chaos.